So without further ado, Erica Robinson, take it away and teach us everything you know. Inspire us.
Well, thank you, sir. Actually, before you and Jen run away, I got a question. In Zoom, is there a way that I can turn off the little ding noise for who's entering waiting room? Do you know if that's a thing?
Not that I have discovered.
Okay.
I think it's something that has to be done
Oh, like
during the setup. So yeah, for this one, we might just have to.
Got it. Okay. No big deal. Yeah, no worries. Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen in a second here. All right, here we go. Cool. All right. Well, hello again, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. And I couldn't agree more with both Ben and Jen about just keep taking pictures. That is something that, I talk about a lot in my travel and storytelling workshop as well. But just to spend time with our images, spend time with our photography, think outside the box, and now while we have the time to do so, really spend quality time with that. There's so many stories and so much going on right now, and thinking about connecting it today with the world of wide angle. There's our wide angle can offer so much information, so we're gonna dive into that today. What I hope, though, out of everything, I hope that if you get one thing, it's that you're inspired to photograph more, that you're inspired to try something new. If wide angle usually isn't the lens in your bag, try it. I encourage you to literally leave your house with just one lens that day. If you're going to take a walk, your daily walk around the park or your daily walk around the neighborhood, and you take your camera with you, like I do all the time, take just one lens, take your wide angle and see what you can create with it. When I first started shooting, I started shooting weddings, oh man, years ago. And as much as I knew I didn't want to shoot weddings for forever, I learned a lot. The woman that I was working with was a brilliant photographer. She was not only incredibly talented, but she was business savvy, and she had a British accent, so she could get away with anything. But I digress. But one of the things that she made me do when I first started shooting with her was to take only one lens with me. She took away all of my zooms. At the time, I think I had like an 18 to 200. I really didn't have much. She took away everything, and she gave me 2 primes. Or 3 primes, excuse me. She gave me a 35, a 50, and a 135. And during certain sections of the day, she would make me only take one. And it really helped me kind of train my eye to see a very particular angle of view. So again, I encourage you to maybe try that method. If you're not used to using a very particular angle, it might benefit you to grab just that one lens and really train your eye and train your thoughts into seeing that particular way. So on that note, these are some general, excuse me, losing my voice. These are some general focal ranges. Now, I consider all rules in photography more like guidelines. They're there to help you pursue your art and your craft. They're not necessarily telling you that something is hard, set, and fast, that you have to do specifically that thing, especially when it comes to the angle that you photograph. I know that I photographed a hummingbird outside of my window with an 85mm prime. Would you ever think to use an 85mm prime fixed lens for a bird, especially a bird that's that small? No. So your lens has to work for you. You have to know how to use it properly, and that will help you photograph. Really, as simple as that. So these are some kind of general guidelines. 10 to 24 is definitely more in our ultra wide angle. 24 to 50, generally about wide angle. 50mm is considered normal. So when we say, so there's we have a 45mm prime. If you put 43mm on a full frame lens, that sees about 55 degrees of an angle, which is what we see naturally. So that is the closest to what our human eye naturally sees on a day-to-day basis. So if you want something to get outside and see naturally what we see with one lens, grab our 45mm prime. That's going to be the closest to our normal. Then of course 50mm to 300, anything within there is considered telephoto or zoom. And then 300mm and up is considered ultra telephoto or mega zoom. All different names and all different terms for these, but really, like I said, your lenses and things just have to work for you. Bear with me one sec while I plug back in this little mic here. Make sure that's working. There we go. Okay. So when I'm talking about these angles, our angles can be kind of changed and varied in a couple of different ways. And the first way, of course, is by our lens. All right. So if we're of course going to get a very different angle with a 300mm than we are 50, than we are a 10mm, just like we saw in that chart. This one here was shot at about 150mm with a 28 to 300mm lens. I have 3 images from the same scene that I'm going to show you, just with three different images for sure, but definitely just to show you kind of how the angles are working. This was shot with our 15 to 30, super wide, same scene, but now when I put that surfboard on the top there, I can see the view in its entirety plus some. I had a whole lot of negative extra space from that image to this image. So I wanted to fill in that negative space with my 15 to 30. And then kind of another image in that series there, this was again shot with the 28 to 300, but compared to that first one that was shot at 150mm, this one was shot all the way zoomed out at 300mm, and it very much so, of course, changed our angle. The other way we're going to be changing our angle, if we are not changing our lens itself, is by moving us. We are the photographer, we are the artist, we are trying to put something onto our film that our viewer wants to consume, right? So by changing our view, our way of thinking, and physically moving our feet, that's going to be a great way to change our angle. So I have 3 images here that I'm going to show you. This image here over at the, of course, St. Louis Arch, and you have the entire city underneath. But I wanted to change it up a little bit and still kind of keep the city, but get a different view of the arch. Because generally everyone will typically head down there to get this same stereotypical shot, which is fine. It's a beautiful image, and it's a beautiful way to photograph the city and the arch. But sometimes you want to make your images a little bit just different than somebody else's. You want to think outside the box and create something unique to you. So I got a little bit closer. And then getting in even closer. And this is something that, again, we had changed our angle earlier with our changing up our lens. Now we're changing up our angle by physically moving our feet and moving ourselves. I don't know about you guys. I know that you weren't necessarily there for the shot, but if you have been to the St. Louis Arch, I stood under there and took this image, and I got really dizzy, and I kind of like it was just a little too much for me to look up. I'm afraid of heights. And what's weird is that I wasn't standing on anything high. I was literally standing underneath it, but watching the length that the 15 to 30 created, it just made it look 10 times higher than it even is in real life. So I got super crazy. Anyway, next little series I want to go through here is a few images at different millimeter length, looking at a subject, right? So in this case, our subject is a person, but whether your subject was a puppy or a lizard or whatever that is, your subject is going to have some different distortions to it. So we want to make sure that whatever we are photographing with that particular angle, that we're watching our edges, we're watching our compression, and we're understanding visually what our lenses are going to create before we even create it. That's why kind of when I was saying earlier to get out there and practice is your best bet, I generally will know what lens I want to take out of my bag for a photo shoot before I even shoot it, because I like that structure. I've had practice enough with my lenses where I can physically just take out that lens and go and be ready to shoot the image that I see in my head. So practice makes perfect, but Again, anyway, we're going to start here at 50 millimeter. And what I want you to do is watch not only the compression within the background, but watch her facial features and see what happens to her face as I zoom out of it, okay? So here we're at 50 millimeter, 30 millimeter, 24 millimeter, and 15 millimeter. Okay, so I'm gonna go back through it, back to the beginning so you can see there. And again, watch her facial features and see kind of how they change, because this is something that you will need to kind of essentially be prepared for if you are out there photographing people, or that dog or that lizard, whatever it is, so that you are watching for these distortions and these changes in someone's features. 50 millimeter here, 30, and notice it gets a bit wider on your edges and her face starts to become a bit longer. 24 millimeter, things get even wider, and she kind of you start to see a little bit of distortion here on her eyes and on her eyebrows. It looks like her face is more kind of towards us in the middle than it is on the outside, if that makes sense. And then of course 15 millimeters. And this is, she was in the same position, her and I didn't move. We just made sure that we changed up the lenses to get this kind of different variability with the edges to see what it would look like. And at 15 millimeters, it's of course drastically different than what it's going to look like at 50. And again, it's personal preference. There's nothing right or wrong in our images. All of these rules, as I've said, are guidelines. They're things to help us understand our photography better. I would generally say for portraits, depending on the style, I'm shooting sometimes anywhere from 15 if I want to, all the way up to 300. I know Mark, one of our coworkers, he's shot portraits with the 150 to 600. So there's all different ways to look at our angles. So kind of changing up a little bit here. What I would like to dive really deep into today is thinking about our composition. Thinking about how we create images that are unique to our style of photography. And really, when we think about wide angle, things become a little bit more extreme when we use a wider angle lens. Our backgrounds look like they're quite a bit further away. We have a lot more information in our foreground. Sometimes things look smaller than they actually are. Sometimes we need to know, to be honest, when it's better to use a wide angle or when it's not a great time to use a wide angle. So again, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but when is a better time to use one and when's a better time not to use one? So we're going to kind of touch base on all these little aspects here, thinking about our focal point, leading lines, perspective, all of these, what I kind of call puzzle pieces into building our images and how kind of more intensely they look when we're thinking about wide angle. So first, I did give it a little definition here. I did not write the definition. I just copied it from the dictionary. But I think perspective is one of the things that we really need to be aware of, specifically when we're talking about wide angle. The appearance of things relative to one another is determined from the viewer. So this is us moving, right? So this is us moving around. This is making sure we have the proper lens on there to show the viewer this angle that we're trying to show them. Our perspective is going to make all the difference in this image, okay? So let's say just kind of for example, in this image here, I was standing, right? I'm only about 5 feet tall. I'm super short compared to Ben, that's for sure. So him and I would have taken this image drastically different because he's got like 2 feet on me. If he was standing there, he would have shot it at a different angle than I would. But this is how I wanted to see it. This is how I wanted to show my viewer what I was looking at. If, for example, I had gotten super, super low and I had kind of maybe either laid on the ground, or if I have an articulating screen, I put my camera on the ground and lift up my articulating screen. I then have a more intense foreground and kind of a dropped off background, or it may not even have seen too much of that at all. So in this case, I still wanted to make sure that my foreground was prominent, but that I had a good amount of the background going on in there. And that would have changed, again, just with a simple movement and change in perspective. This image here, this would, if I had moved over 2 inches to the right, not far at all, just a couple inches over, I would have lost that little yellow leaf that's down on the bottom left-hand side that almost acts as a leading line from my background to my foreground. So in this previous image here, we have a lot of leading lines, man-made leading lines, moving our viewer's eye through our frame. So compositionally, they were very important to keep in there to move to our background, right? This isn't necessarily a man-made line at all. We have a little leaf, but this little leaf is kind of in a pattern moving us to the background of our frame. It connects us by color. We have this yellow in the bottom left and now our yellow in the top right, helping move my viewer's eye through the frame. And that's all about perspective. That's all about me making sure I'm in the right place at the right time. And then if I had moved over 2 inches, I would have lost that bit of perspective. It's all about the little things. Our leading lines again. So leading lines don't necessarily have to be man-made. In this case, we have a lot of man-made leading lines, and there's also not a rule saying that you have to just have one leading line. In here, I probably see maybe 3 or 4, or maybe 4 or 5 even. All of these lines moving my viewer's eye from the foreground, from the front to the back of my image. That way, my viewer's eye kind of rotates all around it. And this only would have been, this is enhanced with our wide angle. If I had shot this with maybe, let's say, even just a little different, like a 50 millimeter, or I had on my 70 to 200 and shot it at maybe 70 millimeter, I could have lost a lot of that information that was leading my viewer's eye around. In this case, I'm kind of using my corners of my frame. So each of those leading lines match up with a corner, right? They're pulling them all in from different corners, trying to follow throughout the frame. So your wide angle can enhance these lines and bring them more prominently to your viewer. We can also get creative with those leading lines, right? We don't have to look at everything straight on. And I know that I'm totally a culprit of that. Sometimes I kind of get wrapped up in the moment and I shoot things very head on sometimes. But you're leading, because these lines become so elongated when we are using our wide angle, sometimes it's really beneficial to look at them from a different perspective, to get low and look up, to get high and look down, whatever that is. But that way we are elongating, we are making the best use we can out of all of these cool lines that we have out in the world, even if that's just on your porch, right? I've been doing a lot of photography just right off I have this little like 2-foot balcony out on my porch. And I'll sit out there sometimes with my camera and my tea and just hang out. And I have these little kind of bars separating me from falling off this balcony. And a lot of times I'm photographing through these little bars and I'm using them as leading lines, or a lot of times I've had little birds come sit right on the little patio bar. So I'll put my camera really low and use the angles up just like these trees are. So it's just taking advantage of the natural lines that are out in our world, because the wide angle will enhance them. So another puzzle piece to our, when thinking about our composition, another one of these puzzle pieces is our scale. Scale, you know, I talk a lot about in my my travel photography class as well, because when we're traveling, when we're photographing, we tend to forget that since our viewer wasn't there, they don't really know how big or how small a scene really was. And wide angle can kind of make or break that. And we're going to touch base back on this in just a couple of minutes. But in this example here, wide angle can help within our scale, and it can show us how big or how small our scene and situation really was. When we put something naturally in our scene, that our brain knows how big it is, right? This image wouldn't have necessarily been able to be created properly with a longer lens, with a 50 or 70 or 100 millimeter lens. It wouldn't have necessarily, it would have had a completely different compression, and it would have looked like a toy. It would have looked quite a bit smaller. Whereas with our wide angle, we can get down in there nice and close and really elongate all of those lines and features that that car has to offer. I just wanted to put this in here to make sure you knew how big and how small the scene really was. Helps our viewers' eye understand a bit more. Now, while it may seem like we are kind of overthinking a lot of those things, it may seem like we are uh, really kind of diving deep into um, forcing our image, right? We're not forcing our image. A lot of these things are done naturally. A lot of these things are done subconsciously. Um, you constantly look for your focal point in your image. You're always looking at your rule of thirds to make sure that your image is aesthetically pleasing to your viewer. Sometimes it is better, in this case, if your subject is on the top right or bottom left corner. But sometimes we break that rule of thirds, and sometimes our subject is more beneficial in the center of our frame. So we're not necessarily overthinking any of these things. Sometimes we're looking at ways to frame our subject and break down that negative space. And in this case, using reflections to double over more information in our frame. So we aren't necessarily overthinking our frame. A lot of these things are done naturally, and I would encourage you to go back through a lot of your images now that you have some time at home. Go back through, maybe a Lightroom catalog from like a year or two ago. Go back through those frames and see those patterns that you're creating. I was recommended to do that recently, and I was actually really amazed at a lot of things that I was shooting a few years ago that are still a really similar style to how I'm shooting now, just in a better way. So it's the same type of style. You just get better at grow as a photographer, but you start to notice all of those little different patterns of, where you place things or how you frame things. And that'll either help you with those habits or help you break those habits. So I guess it could go both ways. Now, we can use wide angle for everything. First, of course, I want to touch on landscapes, because landscapes is it's so common that that's what we're using for, or a lot of times we are using our wide angles for landscapes. But, and I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, it is not the only thing that you use your wide angle for. I use my wide angle for everything. So we're going to start here with landscapes, because I'm going to give you a couple of tips that I think will kind of help make or break your landscapes out there. Sorry guys, my little clicker isn't working, so it's a little slow today. But first, kind of going back to that scale in the composition piece we were just talking about, wide angle really enhances sizing. Okay, so when we are out in a situation, for those of you who have been here, this is out in Monument Valley, this vista is huge. It's absolutely massive. So a lot of times we think that our wide angle is really the first lens that we should grab, because we want to be able to see everything. But what our wide angle does in seeing everything is it makes our subject look really small because it's far away. So these are mountain size, these are massive, but because they are further away, and because my wide angle makes us seem like we're further away, it also makes it seem a whole lot smaller. So one of the things that you can do to help your viewer understand the scene a little bit more is by controlling more of your foreground. In this case, there are a couple of really big boulders on this kind of cliffside there. And of course, they help separate us from falling off a cliff. But what they also are helpful for photographers is, again, with scale and forming some type of understanding and separation between our foreground and our background. Now, when I kind of mentioned earlier, knowing when to use and when not to use your wide angle, I've actually found that within my landscapes, this is often a question that I have to ask myself. Because if I don't have any sort of interesting foreground that's close enough to me, really all I'm doing is cutting my scene in half. So in this particular image, I don't have any middle ground. We want to think about our landscapes, specifically when we're using wide angle, as having a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. This just kind of cuts it in half, gives me a whole lot of sky and a whole lot of kind of mid-ground here, but nothing in my foreground to kind of break it up. Doesn't have any leading lines to move my viewer's eye through there. I was lucky that on this day I had some nice white puffy clouds, so it helped in that case. But it's not necessarily it doesn't necessarily have enough oomph for my viewer to really want to stare at it for long enough and let their eye wander through the frame. So what I want us to think about is breaking down our frame into a foreground, a midground, and a background, like the distant, to make sure that we have all three of those layers. There are many cases where then you'll find a really great foreground. You'll have this element that leads more interest into your scene, leads more interest into your background, but your midground is so small that you really need to make sure that you enhance the foreground enough that it's interesting enough for your viewer to look at for a long while, because they just have two major parts to look at. They just have this really awesome foreground and then the distant background, which just gives them more of an atmosphere on where they are. But it still kind of splits my image only into two parts. More interesting than the first, but not necessarily enough to, again, keep my viewer really, really engaged. So then kind of like the Goldilocks theory of you have your three pieces here. You have your foreground, you have your midground, and your background, separating all three of these layers so that your viewer has different places to go with their eye. They can start one place, move through the frame, and see all of those pieces. Again, it sounds like we're overthinking a lot of these things. There's a lot of puzzle pieces to think about, but that is why I encourage you to spend some time with your imagery, because it doesn't just, it will come more naturally, of course, the more we practice and the more we play with it. But it's hard to visualize through the camera until you actually sit there and look at it. It's kind of hard to look on that little digital screen or in the viewfinder. One of the things that has helped me really focus on my composition is the Hoodman Loop. I have one of those 3 times Hoodman loops, and because I really hate looking at everything through the viewfinder, I'll look at everything on the back of my screen, but the loop is really helpful because it magnifies everything times 3, so I can make sure that when I am seeing this on a bigger screen, I'm seeing all 3 of those pieces, right? So just, I know, another thing to carry around with us, but it does help me for sure.
Hey, Erica.
Yeah.
Quick question. Someone was just asking if there was any way that you had either your aperture information or focal length information on those the last few images.
Is there any particular image? Because I might be able to go, I can go into my Lightroom and find it.
I think it was just on the last few. Yeah, that's when, then the one before this one.
Yeah, let me, all right.
Well, we can keep going and then come back to it at the end when we open up for other questions. That'd probably be easiest.
Oh, yeah, is that okay? That would be great.
Let's do that. Let's just, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
we'll come back to it.
Remind me at the end, though, because I have my Lightroom right here. I can just pull it right up.
Cool. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Cool. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about those foreground elements. So we've been talking about breaking down our landscape into sections. Again, foreground, middle ground, background. I know I've repeated that a lot, but we're talking about breaking down those sections. When it comes to our foreground, like if we look at this back image here, we had a cool foreground. I knew that my midground wasn't really much that day. It was just kind of a flat nothing. The light was really cool because it was early morning light. This was just after sunrise, but because we're out in the desert, it hits everywhere. So it's not like I just had a little strip of light in the background and a lot of light going on. So my foreground became the most prominent piece of this and kind of the more important part of the story. But there are oftentimes your foreground that can really frame your entire subject, your entire scene in its entirety, basically. Instead of just using it as a focal point, you're now using it as an element to help surround the entire thing. So this here was out in Sedona, Arizona. And again, it's one of those really cool vistas that has so much to look at. But if we just walk up to one of these pieces, take a quick picture and turn around and walk away, we're losing a lot of the opportunity that the scene has to offer us. So I try really, really hard in my work to remember to take a step back and use the pieces that are around me, because they are also they're a part of the atmosphere. They're a part of the landscape that I'm looking at. I don't want to take them away. I want to make sure that they are shared just as much as the main pieces that we go out to see, that we adventure to go see. So just because this branch isn't necessarily the most important tree under the sun, it still, it makes an important piece to the image. Those foreground elements can also take away a whole lot of negative space. I touched on this at the beginning a little bit, but there are a lot of times with our wide angle that we seem to find a whole lot of negative space. Where, let's say we're out photographing this beautiful mountain vista, we have a really big sky, but we don't have much clouds that day, right? If we don't have anything interesting going on in our sky, like this day here was a pretty flat day, there needs to be something to distract your viewer's eye, something to make sure that they're moving towards a subject. So in this case, framing it and taking away all that negative space that was out there, it led my viewer's eye right through. And I made sure that I matched up the end of the umbrella there, the little bottom of the umbrella, closely to the shoreline. So it again matched everything and led it right up through the top left-hand corner of the frame. Lost my train of thought. Hold on. All my slides were mixed up from before. Okay, sorry, little clicker doesn't want to work today. So just like I was kind of talking about with that interesting sky, previous image here, we had nothing in our interesting sky. We had nothing going on. It was a really flat day. There was nothing that a circular polarizer would even do for me. But sometimes our sky then becomes the subject. So if we only, on this day, all I had with me was my wide angle. I had my 15 to 30. And while this is a beautiful scene for those of us who've been there, sometimes it actually calls for a longer angle so that I can compress the barn and the mountains in the background. Luckily enough, though, that day we had a really, really beautiful sunrise and a beautiful sky. So what I did, instead of making the focus on the barn, I tilted a little bit further up, and in tilting up, I gained quite a bit more of that sky and made the sky my subject. The barn wasn't necessarily the subject, the mountain wasn't necessarily the subject, the sky became the subject. I was listening recently to a podcast with someone who was talking about specifically only taking out their wide angle. And he does find himself a lot more when he's doing landscapes, either tilting up quite a bit for the sky or leaning forward and tilting down a bit for our foreground to lead our viewer's eye to the background. Generally, a lot of times for your landscapes, you're not head on, you're not straight on, because that's when you end up cutting kind of your frame in half and splitting it and just having a sky and then a foreground and nothing in the middle. So in this case, tilting a little bit up, not by too much, but just a little bit, forced my viewer's eye to understand that the sky, because we had such a beautiful sky that day, was the subject. And this kind of brought me back. I wanted to put this in my leading lines over here, but this kind of encompasses all of those pieces that we're talking about. How to take away negative space, how to use our leading lines, and how to really take advantage of the fact that wide angle not only can see a full scene, but it can, all of the things that are in our scene can be added elements. I know that a lot of times when we go, specifically to national parks, right? We want to be the only person there. We want to be the only person there. We also want there to be, no fences, no guide barriers, no nothing, no other element that any other human exists. It's not going to happen. I'm really sorry about that. But sometimes we can take advantage of those pieces and really allow our scene to be enhanced. So this is out Yellowstone. We were doing a workshop there last summer, and when we waited around in the afternoon for one of the geysers to do its thing, and turns out with the beautiful clouds and the beautiful light that we had that day, if you put the light right behind the geyser, it lit it up almost looking like a volcano. But what was happening was that it was, since the puffs of smoke are so white, it was not only overexposing them and giving us this hot spot, but it was a hot spot because the wide angle is so aggressive with its it just kind of enhances everything on our edges. It made everything else also blown out. So what we did was we used the fence line in front, and at F16 created that little starburst there, and really dropped down, losing all of that hot spot there. So the fence there ended up enhancing, because we had our wide angle, letting us lead right through the back of the frame. We found that really, really helpful that day. All right, so we talked about, of course, we really dug into landscapes and things, but there are so many other ways that you can use your wide angle. And I actually, as much as I love landscapes, I don't necessarily consider myself a landscape photographer. I do a lot of travel and documentary and storytelling work, because I like to document the scene around me. I like to see what's going on. I like to really show that world. So our wide angle can really do that. Our wide angle can bring in the world, almost kind of like, maybe this sounds a little too metaphorical, but it can bring the outside world in and then the inside world out. We can see at all those angles. So in this case, I mean, this is obviously a fashion shot. This was actually not mine. This was from a photographer quite a while ago. But I love the fact that the photographer, when doing fashion, used the entire city as an element. And the only way to do that was with a wide angle. You can also really create some really great lines with your models when you're doing these things, specifically, of course, with fashion. The lines, not only of your scene, but the lines of the model become a lot more enhanced. The lines of your person become a lot more enhanced. So she's, looks quite a bit taller in this frame, longer in this frame. And instead of, again, just looking at her straight on, going a little bit lower helped elongate all of that. Wide angle for architecture. For anything interior, I have a couple of great friends. My buddy Leo, who is an incredible architectural photographer. Our 15 to 30 in particular is a rectilinear lens. So, well, actually our 17-28 as well. All of these wide angle lenses are rectilinear, forcing these edges to be super, super straight. And those are things that you're looking for when you're doing architectural work, whether that's in a building or outside of a building. You're looking for these lines. You want them to be straight. You want to make sure that the wide angle that you're using is appropriately shaping those lines. And then, as I said, I use a lot of my wide angles for storytelling, for work when I'm on the road and traveling. This is a gentleman named Jerry that I photographed when I was actually out in Oregon. I was out on the coast photographing a shipwreck out there. And I didn't know, because Ben didn't tell me, that the beaches become highways at night when it's low tide for all the clammers. I had no idea. But Jerry was, this was about 11 o'clock at night, and Jerry was kind enough to stop me and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm photographing a shipwreck. What are you doing? And why is everybody driving up and down the beach?" He said, "Well, because this is a highway right now, and we abide by highway rules because we're clamming and fishing." Okay, cool. So anyway, he had his stack of clams over his shoulder. He tossed them right over on the ground and asked if I wanted to photograph them. And of course, as I was photographing them, I wanted a photo with him in there. So he leaned down to kind of move them all around. And it became a really nice environmental portrait, because not only did I have what he originally planned as the subject for the clams, but he is now my subject. I have the tool that he was using. He is very clearly dressed in fisherman's gear. He's got his headlamp on, his hat, his waders. And then we brought in a bit of the scene, so you can tell that it is sand. And the sky was nice enough at that point where I had a bit of light from the city in the background, enhancing the separation between the sky and the foreground. So as I said, your wide angle doesn't necessarily just have to be used for landscapes. A lot of nature photographers, a lot of wildlife photographers will use their wide angles. Even if it's just for something as simple as this. This was out in an aquarium. And one of the great things about our wide angle is if we physically walk up to the glass, put our lens right on that glass, we're going to take away all the reflections that are going on back there. So you won't see yourself trying to take the photo in the glass. Just get right up nice and close, plant your lens right on that glass, and it will take away those reflections. But in turn, you get to see all of what's going on under the sea, basically. And because all of those subjects are so close to you, they stay an average size. So that's super helpful. I used a lot of my wide angle for a long time for weddings. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not much of a wedding photographer anymore. But recently, due to COVID, I have a couple of friends out here in California that were getting married and needed some photos taken because they couldn't have their big wedding. So I went down and did some portraits for them. And your wide angle allows for some really interesting portraits. You want to keep your subject as close to you as you can so that you really make sure that they are still the subject versus, you know, those buildings back there that don't really matter. But I can follow all sorts of other elements. I have their shadow back there of them kissing in the background. So I know that this is obviously them. We have them in the foreground and them in the background. Wouldn't have been able to happen with a 70 to 200 or even a 50 or anything like that. I really enhanced all of my foreground. You can, again, for weddings, create some kind of cool elements. These are some portrait styles that I just found online that I wanted to give a try. I tried it with 4 different lenses. I tried it with the fixed 45. I tried it with a 70 to 200. I tried it, of course, here with the 15 to 30. And then I tried it with, I had a 4th lens and I can't remember what it was. Tried it with all 4 regardless. The 15 to 30 was definitely the best choice for this style. I had to get in literally an inch or 2 away from his hand to make sure that that was large enough and that she was tiny in the background and could fit right inside of that ring. And again, it's kind of a lot of trial and error with our wide angle so that we can create the right aspect. I use my wide angle a lot for travel, specifically when I am trying to, again, get that kind of internal to external feel. A lot of times I find myself photographing a specific subject on the street and I don't have any depth to it. I'm just walking around and I have just my subject and maybe the background, and that's okay. But I don't have any depth into understanding where they are, what's going on in the scene, what's going on in the frame. So thinking about elements that I can use around me and create to have kind of an internal to external look on my view, a wide angle is really one of the only ways to do that. Street life. This was with the 17 to 28 in Havana, Cuba. And again, with environmental portraits, thinking about our different angles and not just head on with our portraits. This was one of the boxers that we photograph every year. And instead of just photographing him dead on with, him boxing like he does all the time, I wanted to understand him a little bit more and little pieces of his day. So by walking, we basically walked over when he was kind of sitting down, unwrapping all of his hand gear. He was leaned right up against the barriers there. I don't even know what they're called. But by walking over and kind of looking down, I stood on the pole behind him. By looking down, the only way I was able to create this was with the 17 to 28 at 17. I tried it also with the 28 to 75, and I had another 50 millimeter on me as well, or 45 millimeter, excuse me. And 17 was, I think it was actually probably about 20. was a perfect angle for me to be right above him and get everything below. So with that, I know that was kind of a lot of information and a lot of different lenses and angles to think about, but this is me. You can find me on social media as Tamron Tech Erica, both on Facebook and Instagram. I know that, so I'm going to bring Ben back in to go over some questions. I know that someone had a question about a specific image and its exposure information. So I'm going to go find that.
Okay. While you're looking for that, probably because I feel like you can answer this question without really concentrating. Somebody had wondered what you lit the clamming, the image of the gentleman on the beach with.
Just his light.
Just from his like a headlamp.
Yeah, so he had that pole here. Hold on, I'll swing back to it.
And then I suppose we'll.
Yeah, then I'll get back to that other info. But yeah, so just this light here.
Oh, gotcha. I see. Okay.
Yeah, so the light that's on his shovel, it reflected right back up under his hat there. That's why, so I let him keep his hat on because it actually shaded a lot of this harsh light that was here. And it bounced right back up off the sand into his face.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. I've seen that image like 100 times in your presentations. Never knew that's how you lit it. I always thought it was, there's some kind of thing on his head, but looking at it again. Another quick question here, and I definitely did. Well, let's go in order. That way, anybody
let me
that
find
ask first.
the picture for you because I'm gonna forget where it is.
Oh, good call.
I thought, almost there. Okay, so the image at Anza-Borrego was shot at 22 millimeters, ISO 400, 1/160th of a second at f8.
Do you use flash?
No. No, I didn't.
That one just came in. I'll just ask you now. And actually, there's one right above that. Could you provide exposure information for the night shot of Cuba?
Yes.
I think the one of the car is what we're referring to.
Sure thing.
And maybe since we're getting several questions about exposure, focal length, things like that, you could do a quick recap of the sort of rules of thumb for shooting wide angle and specifically landscapes or cityscapes.
Sure. Okay, so I have the exposure information for the car in Cuba was 3200 ISO, a 17 millimeter focal length, 1/100th of a second, f2.8.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. So I hope that helped. Okay, so sorry, you said some general rules of thumb for shooting wide angle?
Yeah, just because, I know that, typically if you're doing landscape, then, a smaller aperture is better because you get more depth that way, things like that
Sure.
might kind of help the folks understand when you're going into a situation, what you're putting your settings, what you're, going in with your settings set to.
Yes. Okay, so what I will do is I'm going to pull back up a couple of these landscape images, right? So there's a couple of things that I think about specifically when I am trying to create a nice wide angle of the scene that I was at. So in this image, I do remember going into it thinking, well, I don't really have any middle ground. I have my distant ground. I have a really cool foreground because we were at this place in Anza-Borrego called Clark Dry Lake, which is literally a dry lake bed that I hiked 9 miles in to sleep on for the night. And it was hot as anything out there. But anyway, the first things that I was thinking about was, okay, well, I have a great foreground, I have a decent background, but I don't have anything in the middle. If I do this in the sunrise, I'm going to have some really cool light. So I want to make sure that I do it with cool light so that I have the dimensions within all of these little, all the dry lake pieces, right? Because if I do it when it's just kind of midday, it'll be too harsh. If I do it too late, it's going to be flat. Like if there's not really great light. So I wanted to make sure I did it with good light. And I knew that with that sun, unless I shot it at around, this was shot about f11, because I wanted to try and kind of starburst the sun that was in the top right corner. But because it was so bright and I couldn't really, you kind of have to play hide and seek with the sun a little bit and kind of move around so that it peaks just off of the mountains there where you can get that starburst. I couldn't get it to quite do that with the mountains. It was just a little bit too high. So I completely cut out and moved away from worrying about that element in there. But keeping it at, I think it was F11, F16, I could have everything from my foreground to my background in focus. It says that, I think that's what it was. I have to go back and take a look again at the measurements, but I know usually going into things, I think in 3 stages. I think, okay, do I have a background, foreground, middle ground, exposure wise, what do I want to see? Do I want to see depth of field? Do I want to see the whole thing? Do I want it to be shallow? And of course, what about my light? Do I want my light to be harsh? Do I want it to be flat? How do I want to see that light? So those are kind of the 3 elements that I'm going into thinking of. And again, we have to think about these on the extreme because we are wide angle and because it sees so much.
Cool. So now I'm going to go back. I've gathered everybody's questions, so bear with us, folks. In a composition, would you say it's the viewer's interest that's paramount or the photographer's?
Ooh, that's a great question. And honestly, it depends on what you're using it for. And I know you're not going to like that answer, but if you're photographing for you, if you're photographing for, images to show of a trip, or just to show family, or just to create your own memories, then it's for you. If it's going in an editorial magazine and you're shooting for someone, then we have to photograph for the viewer. I actually find that a lot of times I'm photographing for the person, place, or thing that I'm photographing. And I recently kind of realized this, I'd say over the past couple of years, because I got more involved with storytelling photography and kind of peeling back the different layers of what I was photographing and thinking about why I photograph. So asking the same question that you just asked me, but in a slightly different way. So asking why I photograph, not who I'm doing it for. When I figured out why I photograph, to bring a story to light, to share an understanding of something, to create genuine human connection, to share a voice that hasn't been heard yet, all of these reasons, that helped me determine who I was photographing for. So while that may not be a yes or no answer, I think there's a lot of elements that go into thinking about
that. I think that's a great answer. It works for me. I think that was George that asked that one. So hopefully
Nice.
that was a good answer for George.
Hopefully that.
And then earlier you had mentioned a podcast. Someone was asking that if you could share that information again.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Podcast is called We Are Photographers. It's put on by Creative Live, by Kenna Klosterman. Kenna is a really good friend of mine, also a great photographer, and her podcast features photographers from all around the world, all different subjects, all different genres, all different styles, all different intensities, everything. And there's a lot of episodes out there. I think I was episode 70 or something like that. So there's a whole lot of episodes for you to listen to out there now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Got a nice little list of them here for you. Someone would like a little more explanation on rectilinear lenses. What they are, what make them different or special from other lenses.
Yeah. So if you look specifically at our let's say our 15 to 30, for example, 15 to 30, if you look at the end element on that lens, it's a big lens, right? It has a lot of heft to it. Worth it just has a lot of heft to it. So that round element there, people will often ask if it is a fisheye. It's not a fisheye. It is rectilinear, which means that those edges and that roundness is there to correct for any roundness in your edges on your image. So if you're photographing an internal space and you have doors or a door frame or walls or ceiling or anything with these leading lines, we want to make sure that those lines are straight, right? And so that end element being that big round element, even though it is round, it's correcting for the roundness on our edges to make sure that we don't warp.
Expertly explained. Mark would be very proud.
Thanks, Mark. You're right.
Let's
He said
see.
it with many more impressive words than I did.
Well, that's true. Someone else wanted to know if you shoot aperture priority, if you ever have, and if when you might shoot aperture priority and what kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. Okay, so yes, I have definitely shot an aperture priority before. So of course, our four pieces on that dial there are going to be our auto, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. I generally want to shoot in manual as much as I can, probably because I'm a control freak, but because I want to make sure that I'm controlling all parts of my scene, all elements of my scene. But there are certainly times where aperture priority is incredibly useful. Certain moments where I am taking portraits, or I want to be sure that my depth of field is the first thing that I'm controlling. So if depth of field is priority in that image, I want to make sure I have a really shallow depth of field. Maybe I'm way down at f2.8 or f4 or something like that, so that I'm that I don't really care about what the shutter speed is. If I'm set up on a tripod, I'm not worried about going too low. Aperture priority may be just fine. And it really does just depend on what image you're trying to create, because we have to think of what our camera is going to think when it's in control of the other part. So in shutter priority and aperture priority, you're only in control of half of the pieces. So in aperture priority, you control the aperture, the camera controls the shutter. So if I decide that I want f16, right, and I want all my foreground and my background in focus, if it's at dusk and if it's pretty late in the day, we don't have a lot of light, we have to know in our mind that our camera is going to say, okay, well, that's fine, but you need more light. I need more light. I need to eat up all that light. So I'm going to have a slower shutter speed. So if I'm handheld, it won't be so great. So I maybe need to be on a tripod at that point. So these are just kind of the elements that you think of, the domino effect of what it will do. And maybe in that case, you're boosting up your ISO, or, and then on the other side of things, if you are using shutter priority, you're choosing the shutter, the camera is then choosing the aperture. So we need to know, okay, well, it's going to either show me a lot or a little of depth of field because it's choosing it for me. So there's no reason why you can't use aperture priority or shutter priority. You just have to know what it's going to do for your image.
Very thorough answer.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just adjusting my microphone there so that we don't.
So it doesn't scratch.
I keep having. And then the last question I had for you, someone was asking, I don't know if they caught a look at your Lightroom there when you're looking up your settings, but they wanted to know what do you use in the transform dropdown in Lightroom?
Transform dropdown in Lightroom. Let's see.
Let's see if I can go back and find who. It's from TJ. TJ, you still with us?
Let's see.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So a lot of times it'll be a like to correct for my horizon line. So oftentimes I'm not shooting that straight. I can be like this, or I can be like this. Not always totally level. So my transform tool will help me with my horizon. I can also use the crop tool for that. If I go into the crop tool and click on angle, I can click on angle and drag it. So if there's the horizon line, I can click from left to right or right to left and drag on the horizon line, and it will properly change my level for me. But that's almost the only thing that I'm using in my transform tool is that.
I didn't know that about the horizon line. I feel like I would use that all of the time.
Yeah, I do.
Wow, look at, make a little note of that to myself. All right, folks. Any other last questions here for Erica before we call it a day? It was good. A lot of great questions. I'm glad that I love when people have lots of questions for you, because then it's like there's a lot of times with things that I don't even know and would like to know the answer to.
Yeah, I agree.
Lots of compliments down here. I don't know if you're looking,
thanks,
if you can see your chat room.
I can't, but I'll jump into there. I love it. I always have to get really close to my computer to do it, and I just want to make sure that I'm paying attention, right? So, yeah, thank you. No, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the questions. Thank you to your store and to Jen for having me. Thanks for Ben for always asking great questions and listening and paying attention to all my crazy rambles. I hope to catch you guys on the road sometime really, really soon.
Oh, same. Yeah, no, it'd be wonderful. We'll see. We'll cross our fingers, stay safe, hope for the best. And yeah, thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Looking Glass, Erica, and we'll see you guys next week.
Yeah, I'm excited. And Erica, as always, it's such a pleasure. It's such a pleasure to have you. You're just so thoughtful in everything you do, and every single time you give a presentation, I'm so happy to see you and hear everything you have to say. It's why people keep coming back, just to hear from you. You care. You really do. It's obvious, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I really I as much as seeing all of you guys this way isn't as we'd all like it, what's kind of cool is that like maybe we didn't get to talk to everybody in here, but there have been people that have jumped in from like Brazil and Portugal and Quebec, and I had someone in from Australia the other day. Like, you guys are on totally different time zones and you're coming to hang out and watch. So that's pretty great. I appreciate the fact that you guys are doing all these and allowing people the opportunity to learn. So thank you.
Absolutely. And it's honestly, it's so incredible, like being able to host people from literally anywhere and have these conversations, not just the participants, but also the speakers. So it's fantastic. Thanks for being with us.
Totally.
And somebody just asked quick, what was on tap for next week? Boy, that sounds delicious. And it is delicious. It's Erica again, back with us doing her storytelling.
It's my favorite class.
One of my favorite webinars that anybody in Tamron does. It's really incredible. So if you guys, yay, yeah. So definitely look forward to that one. If you haven't signed up for that one yet, do so. For anybody that joined late or asking for a friend, this presentation, as always, will be available. Come later for you guys to view again. So, but yeah. So other than that, we will see everybody, all of us, again next week.
Next week. Well then, guys, everybody take good care.
Yeah, take it easy, everybody.
Bye.